think we're live now.
Hi, everyone.
Uh, I'm Ian Bushfield, Executive Director of the BC Humanist Association. I'm joined by.
I'm Dr. Teale Phelps Bondaroff, the Research Coordinator for the BC Humanist Association.
We're really proud to be here celebrating Religious Neutrality Day, a holiday of recognition that we've declared to mark the 10th anniversary of the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in movement like Quebecois versus Saguenay. Before we get too deep into that, I want to recognize that I'm coming from the traditional unceded territories of the Coquitlam First Nation, and I appreciate the ability to live and work on these lands.
And I'm joining folks from the Saguenay People's traditional territories. And yeah, it's a pleasure working on this project in a beautiful part of the world.
I want to encourage people as you're watching, I know there's a few of you in here, and hopefully we'll get more as we go. Throw comments in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on that, and we will answer as many questions as we can. We're going to have kind of a free-form discussion about the decision and about our Saguenay project, about the work we've been doing on religious neutrality. I think to start, though, I want to recognize the wonderful news that the City of Vancouver proclaimed Religious Neutrality Day. My Zoom filters are annoyingly making this hard to read.
Your Zoom filters are being discriminatory, Ian.
I
This is
know.
this is a problem.
That's Ken Sim's signature on the bottom corner. Recognizing today, we also got a proclamation from the City of Toronto Mayor Olivia Chow, and I put that up on our social media as well. I don't have the fancy document of that. That should go to Humanist Association of Toronto. And if they can send me a picture, we'll put that out as well. But we have the text of it at least.
Well, so Ian, why today? Like why April 15th? Why are we making April 15th Neutrality Day? What's the point? Why this day of all other
Yeah,
days?
it's 10 years to the day to when the Supreme Court of Canada issued that decision in a case that took almost 10 years of one individual atheist who went to his local city council, Elaine Simoneau, and realized the mayor was doing a very Catholic prayer and then crossing himself at every city council meeting. And he did not like that. He did not feel welcome at his city council. So he went through the long, arduous process of filing a human rights complaint at the Quebec Human Rights Commission. That had to be investigated, and he fought it. He got support from movement like Quebecois, a group that still exists today, and they won the Human Rights Tribunal. It went to the Quebec Court of Appeal, where they lost, and then it went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, where they won unanimously. And happy birthday, Andy, who's watching.
Hey, well, it's a great birthday. And so when the case was at the Supreme Court, this was a definitive case. The Supreme Court ruled that you cannot include prayer in a municipal council meeting. And it was really clear that the state has a duty of neutrality. That's kind of why we're calling it Neutrality Day. And that this duty was a democratic imperative. This isn't just like a nice to have, this is a fundamental to have for our democratic system. And the court also explained what true neutrality meant. It defined true neutrality as abstention, not taking a position at all. So, if you want someone to be truly neutral, they just don't say yes or no. They just stay in the corner and don't get involved in issues relating to religion. And the issue, of course, is that if the state, in this case, the municipal government, has a prayer at a meeting, they're necessarily endorsing one religion over other religions or religion over non-religion. And it creates a space where you're necessarily excluding people who are of non-majoritarian faith traditions and non-believers. And this is really important. Like we in municipal council meetings want to make sure that everyone is welcome. And one of my other lives, when I'm wearing a slightly different hat, I'm a city councilor in the district of Saanich, and we have people coming to our meetings on a regular basis. It might be the only time they interact with their local government. They're talking about a shared fence issue or a local zoning ordinance or a bylaw issue. And they're noticeably nervous. They'll often tell us that they're noticeably nervous, but they're sharing their perspective with council. And we want to make sure that council gets that important information so we can make the best decisions. But when you treat some people like second-class citizens or you make them feel less welcome because of their religious beliefs or lack thereof, you're excluding people. And it creates a space where you aren't actually fostering that kind of engagement. And that's what the Supreme Court found in Saguenay. They were saying, look, let's just not get involved in this. Let's stay neutral and let's get on with the business of the day of running municipalities.
Yeah, the unanimous decision with one justice writing a concurring opinion on the standards of review that we won't get into today because it's above our pay grade and not relevant to the fundamental issues that we talk about with religious neutrality. It's a very strong and clear decision. It's quite readable as long as you skip that standard of review stuff. And it's quite interesting, right? Because the Quebec Court of Appeal really leaned on this cultural heritage argument and that there's a tradition that's allowed, that allows this kind of, you know, it's part of Canada's history. We were founded by Christian nations using Christian principles, often to the exclusion of the Indigenous people here. They used terra nullius and doctrine of discovery from the Catholic Church to basically say they could claim this land. But the Supreme Court looked at the Charter and it looked at the evolving nature of Canadian society and the multiculturalism that is baked into our Charter and said, no, very clearly, we can't preference one faith above others. But Teale, how did they respond to the claims that God is right there at the top of the Charter?
This is actually one of our, we've given this argument a name, right? You know, when an argument comes up time and time again, and it's not a good one, when it has a formal name. And this is the God of the Charter argument, where effectively people were saying, oh, well, you know, the Charter opens with, you know, recognition of supremacy of God. And the Supreme Court was like, no, this is a political theory that doesn't make Canada a theistic state. There's a couple other layers to this as well. Like, this is the preamble. So, like, you wouldn't want the preamble necessarily coloring everything in the document. And of course, it would necessarily contradict with Section 2 of the Canadian Charter, so that wouldn't work. But we get that one a lot. The other one we get a lot is people saying, well, you can still have an inclusive prayer. And Ian, you and I have written a lot about this, where it's like, no, there actually isn't, it's not possible to have an inclusive prayer. And we use that language like really carefully, right? Because saying something is impossible is a very bold statement. It's an affirmative statement, but you can't do it, right? If you have a prayer, it's necessarily going to exclude non-believers. And if you have a prayer that's ecumenical, that includes as many faith traditions as possible, it's going to exclude faith traditions that don't have prayer or don't support public prayer. And the Supreme Court said this as well. Paragraph 137, for those of you who are following along Saguenay at home, says that even if a religious practice engaged in by the state is inclusive, it may nevertheless exclude non-believers because it necessarily will. You're having the state put its finger on the scales in favor of belief over non-belief. We actually saw Vancouver do this in their last inaugural meeting in 2022, where they had 5 religious figures, a Catholic, a Protestant, Sikh, Muslim, and a Jew, give prayers. And it took 13 and a half minutes. It was kind of like a really interesting, I don't know, interesting is not the best adjective, but like a group project. And, you know, some people said, oh, well, this is more inclusive. You're including a wider range of faith traditions. But of course, by giving 13 and a half minutes to religion, you were necessarily favoring religion over non-religion. And then we could dive into it even further, where you're thinking, well, why these religions and not others? Like, you picked one Protestant faith. There's like 40,000 denominations of Christianity. So you picked one. There was no reason to pick that one. And then you picked a couple of other faith traditions, almost all of which were Abrahamic faith traditions, and excluded a ton of other ones. And the state really doesn't have the ability to decide which faith tradition should be represented at a meeting. Like, there isn't a committee that says, and we wouldn't want a committee saying, like, wow, this religion's more important than that religion. And so ultimately, when you try to be inclusive, you necessarily exclude people. That's kind of why I was really excited when you held up that proclamation from Vancouver. We've come on a long journey from Vancouver. Maybe we should just tell folks about like the history of some of our work here in BC, because we're not talking about a project that's been going on for a couple of months. The Saguenay project, a project by the BC Humanist Research Team, has looked at unconstitutional prayer across Canada in municipalities since 2018. And this first came to light in actually my district, and we had some other members reach out to us in 2018 when the inaugural meetings after the general election in 2018. Some of those meetings included prayer. Just maybe some background on this. At municipal council meetings, there's generally regular council meetings that take place on a regular schedule. In our council, it's every 2 weeks. In some places, it's once a month, depending on the size of the municipality, sometimes weekly. And inaugural meetings are those meetings that follow elections. Maybe not right away, but after an election, they have a meeting with more pomp and circumstance and ceremony where new councillors will be sworn in. There's often bagpipes and the national anthem. Sometimes there's Indigenous content. And those meetings, what we found in British Columbia, had a propensity to include prayer. So our first report came out in 2018, and it looked at prayers in, well, it came out after 2018, but it looked at inaugural meetings in 2018, and we found 26 municipalities that had prayer in those meetings. That's 3 years after Saguenay, so it's no excuse. Like, it's been 3 years, and Saguenay was a very prominent legal case. And so those 26 municipalities, And what's interesting here is Vancouver wasn't part of them at that point, I don't think. They violated the Constitution, and then we implemented a wide range of advocacy efforts after those inaugurals to try to convince them to follow the law. What were some of the things that we did, Ian?
Well, I was just going to say, what was also interesting in that first report is we didn't identify any regular council meetings that included
Mm,
prayer at that point, and we still haven't. But we were missing a lot of data. There was a lot of municipalities because websites are for small towns don't get updated or may not even
yeah.
exist. It's hard to do this, and you try emailing, and we don't have quite the volunteer capacity or staff capacity to literally drive around the province, going city hall to town hall and ask them. But we do have the ability to email them, and that's basically what we kept doing for all these different municipalities. We've been emailing them on and off since 2018, not daily, but following the 2022 election, we had a couple emails in advance. We monitored the uh, agendas for many of these municipalities. We didn't monitor Vancouver because they hadn't had a prayer at the inaugural meeting since I think it was 2002. It was just a long time after I think Sam Sullivan was the last mayor who did it, and maybe that was 2005. And so we would
Put you
just
on the
write to
spot
these
here.
municipalities, ask them to make sure that they reflected on the Saguenay decision. We put them kind of on notice. We monitored their agendas. We put out press releases around a few municipalities. I think we got the town of Creston to drop an invocation they were going to do in their inaugural meeting simply by emailing them. And we kept doing that, and we still had a few come through in 2022, but it was a much bigger drop from where we were in 2018.
Yeah, and this is part of our research advocacy approach. So for those of you who are following along, this isn't the only project that we work on as a BC Humanist Association research team, but the approach we've taken is research advocacy. So we do good empirical research, and then actually, as the the title of our 2023 report on prayer in BC was titled, "We yelled at them until they stopped." We effectively waved that research around and encourage people to follow the law and ensure their municipal councils are inclusive. And we had some other changes too. So some of the municipalities like a couple years after Saguenay, you can be forgiven for not necessarily knowing about the court case or necessarily remembering its implications. I think one of the reasons why we saw the examples of prayer in inaugural meetings was these only happen once every 4 years, and as a result, often they'll just recycle the procedures on past meetings. So some of the municipalities responded really favorably after we reached out to them after 2018. One example would be both of the Langleys. So Langley City, they made a motion to receive our correspondence. And then Langley Township actually amended their procedures bylaw as a result of our correspondence. We did get a lot of no responses though, and a couple of acknowledgement of receipts, which is pretty much a standard auto response for emails. And so then what we were doing then is we set up this, as Ian was saying, we monitored municipalities going into the 2022 elections. And some of them, they have to announce their agendas, I think statutorily 10 days before the meetings. And we would email the ones that mentioned that they were going to include prayer. A couple of them did drop prayer from their meetings in those cases, and some of them didn't. We got to the point where we had a number of municipalities that continued to include prayer in their inaugurals in 2022. And initially, there were six. We found one more kind of outlier. It was Belcara, Delta, Parksville, Tumbler Ridge, Vancouver, West Kelowna, and Clearwater. It's also worth noting that Colwood had kind of a prayer in their meeting. They invited a local high school choir to come in and sing, and the high school choir, a public high school choir, I should add, chose Dio Gratias, which is like a Catholic liturgical song. We emailed them and they will rectify that problem moving forward. We think it was one of those situations where people just kind of signed up and didn't know what was happening. But with those other seven municipalities, they included prayer in their meetings. And what we found was they were all Christian, with the exception of Vancouver, which was two Christians, one Jew, one Muslim, and one Sikh. Does sound like an opening of a really bad joke. And disproportionately men as well. In 2018, over 70% of the prayers that were delivered in British Columbia at municipal council meetings in violation of the Constitution were men. And those seven municipalities then received further correspondence from us after their inaugurals. They've now violated the Constitution, in some cases multiple times since Saguenay. And this kind of emboldened us to, I think, take a bit more aggressive action. We have some amazing pro bono legal support, and we followed up with quite serious letters from our legal team. Ian, you were more involved in that process. Tell me a bit more about kind of our legal approach here.
Yeah, I mean, we've been really generous. We've had really generous support from Wes McMillan and his firm since 2017, I want to say. He came in to help us represent us on the Trinity Western University Law School case. And then we've gone back because the team he's surrounded with loves working on the kind of cases we bring up. And so we communicated in advance, and I think Wes was on a sabbatical. And so we worked with Joel Payne, who's also great from the same firm, and planned out a strategy where we'd follow up, you know, personally, we'd reach out as the BC Humanist Association to most of these municipalities. And if they didn't get back to us by our deadlines, we would refer it to him to start escalating the level of threat. And the responses really varied quickly. My favorite, the village of Belcara, which I'm in Coquitlam, is actually just up the road. Town, a village of about 800 people, I think. They had a regular council meeting scheduled for December 4th, but they decided in 2023, and I think they got our letter like 3 days before that. They held a emergency council meeting earlier that afternoon in camera using the sections of the charter relating to litigation potentially affecting the community and receipt of legal advice, where we don't know what they discussed, but it was a 4 minute meeting, I believed. I looked at the minutes that said when it started and ended, and they adopted the resolution that prayers, religious invocations, or any religious observances will not be included in future regular or inaugural meetings of the Village of Belcara Council.
I've sat through a bunch of in-camera meetings with lawyers as a city councilor, and I can tell you that I was actually really surprised when you wrote that in our report that it was like a 4 minute meeting because bringing a lawyer to share, clearly lawyers are hourly in this case, and so they were, Belcar is not exactly a large metropolitan area, but I was really surprised that they made a very quick decision, and I think that's just also like underscores the strength and like how powerful Saguenay is. Like Saguenay is not a wishy-washy Supreme Court decision; it's very clear, and I think was it Belcar that we missed initially and didn't get an email. There was a couple that there was two that we kind of didn't find their information that they'd included prayer in their 2018 inaugural, so they didn't get warning emails from us in advance. And so I think Belcar was one of the ones that acted quite quickly in that case. A couple of them did, and it actually acted as a bit of a control. So we were able to evaluate the effectiveness of our advocacy because there was a couple municipalities that didn't hear from us, and they just continued on, including prayer in their inaugurals. And the fact that those ones continue their practices and most didn't, to me, really underscored the effectiveness of our action. Sorry, please go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, no,
Someone
sorry, I didn't actually write it into the report itself, but the meeting was 1 minute long.
Oh my gosh.
It called to order at 5 p.m. and adjourned at 5:01.
That's
I
fantastic.
do want to remind people who are watching to hit the little like button
Hmm.
here. We don't do a lot of YouTube streams, but I think that is an important thing to do. You can see there's about a dozen people, which is awesome. We'll get some more as we go, especially if you help like and share and all that stuff you're usually supposed to do on YouTube.
And also, friends, that our work depends on the support of members of the public. So if you want to find a copy of the report, Ian's going to put a link in the chat at some point. And that's the report we're releasing today. We haven't even got to it yet. That's the big buildup. Actually, maybe don't put it in yet. We got to build up, Ian. But also, we survive on donations from the public. So if you are enjoying what you're seeing and you're enjoying seeing people who are stepping up for the separation of religion and government and state neutrality in Canada, please support our work. We have an amazing team of volunteers, but we obviously need to exist as an organization. And so that support goes a really long way.
The next municipality we were chasing down, you already mentioned Colwood
Hmm.
and the public school religious song.
Yeah, they've invited schools in the
Yeah,
past, and I think what
yeah.
happened probably was that the choral director was like, "We've got this one song ready from last year, and we'll just run with it." I was in high school choir, and it took a couple of years before our choral director and like conversations with me and the choral director to like inform her that there were songs that weren't just religious. And I think it may have blown her mind because this is like, Calgary. And yeah, we had like 2 or 3 years where every single song was of religious nature. And then eventually our choral director found songs that weren't. So I suspect that's likely what happened. But Colwood is very, I think, accommodating in our correspondence.
Yeah. And we found out from FOIs as well that we have the correspondence between the school and the teacher and the city that show that, they were like, what if we do this song? And the city's like, I guess. The next one we got back from was Tumbler Ridge, the district of Tumbler Ridge. They just called me directly to talk through it, their chief administrative officer. Uh, they had a weird situation in 2022 because they had words of inspiration on their agenda, but it was a pastor who came and
Mm.
delivered them. And so They didn't believe that this was intended as a religious, and they apologized for that appearance. She noted that, he's a well-regarded person who does a lot of good public speaking in the community, and that's why they had him. And he did happen to begin with a Bible quote, which she didn't think was the worst one, but we'll come back to that in the next one. Uh,
People usually, when they opening inspirational Bible quotes, don't pick something from like Leviticus, right? It tends to be something a little more interesting. On that note as well, in my district of Saanich, there were two prayers in 2018, and the city was trying to be ecumenical. They included a Christian prayer and a second Christian prayer. But the interesting thing about the second Christian prayer was it was delivered by a pastor, but if you look at the words, it was very secular in its content. And in this situation, we really wanted to make sure that we're talking about like the perception of state neutrality. So even if you have a pastor delivering an entirely secular words of inspiration, there's still that perception of bias, in my view. It's like you can definitely invite someone else to give that address. It doesn't underscore and reinforce one religion over others. And I think that in that case, the person's making an overt Bible quote. In Saanich's case in 2018, one of those prayers was delivered by was you could read it as secular, but that doesn't really matter. The point is that the state is still endorsing religion by bringing in that figure and giving them a platform, a formal platform in the agenda of that meeting.
Next, from the city of West Kelowna, we got a reply from the chief administrative officer on December 7th. I'll note I had emailed all of these CAOs on November 30th. So this is still like within a week. They're getting back to us because they see that, like, we'll refer you to the lawyers. Like, we don't want that. They pledged to review the decision from the Supreme Court of Canada and any other relevant decisions or legal commentary on the issue to ensure the city is aligned with its governing legislation as well as applicable common law legal principles before the next inaugural meeting in 2026, which, when it delivered in a week, is pretty good for us.
I also think that if they were to do that, or when they do that rather, before the next inaugural meeting, they're going to read the same Supreme Court ruling that we read and come to the similar conclusions that pretty much every single lawyer, barring Winnipeg, have come to. And so effectively, they're going to be like, no, we're not. It's not worth doing. We will be monitoring this, by the way, folks. So after the next round of inaugural elections in 2026 in British Columbia, we'll do another round just to make sure that we're mopping up any outliers or backsliders, as it were. But yeah, I suspect they'll look at the same Supreme Court ruling and realize, yeah, let's not open up a can of unconstitutional trouble.
After that, we didn't get many responses for a while, so we sent another round of letters to mayor and council, and we encouraged supporters to use email tools to write
Hmm.
directly to their mayor. And, we didn't have a lot of people in Delta, but we did get some people writing to their mayor and council there. And so on December 28th, when we give them a deadline of December 31st, we got a reply from Delta's deputy city manager to acknowledge our letter and say that they will take it under consideration and review the matter before the next inaugural.
Yeah, and that's not too bad. Now we had a couple of outliers though, right? There was at least two municipalities that weren't as accommodating. That was Parksville and Vancouver, right?
Yeah. And so, yeah, those are the ones that we forwarded to our lawyer to follow up with. Vancouver city manager did reply to us on January 8th, right as I was getting back from my winter holidays. And that initial email only said the program for each council inauguration ceremony is determined by the incoming mayor. Following the next election, we will address the matter with the mayor-elect for their consideration, which didn't really answer the issue for us at all. They kind
No,
of punted it, and they punted it late.
and like I, as a counselor, I had conversations with counselors from that district, and like also, this is not just formal emails. Like I know these people, I've talked to them at events and let them know that they should probably not, they should respond and engage with this. And one of the things that often gets brought up is municipalities will say, "Oh, well, we represent different faith traditions." But in the case of Parksville, it was the same Baptist church every single inaugural election. They switched pastors in 2022. They went from the general pastor to the youth pastor because the pastor was on vacation. But like it was still the same Baptist church. So the claim that there is a wider range of religious representation is just not the case.
Yeah, and in Parksville's case, Mayor Doug O'Brien did reply to that December 13th email
Hmm.
I sent to Mayor with "Have a nice day."
Yeah. I mean, that's inconclusive, I suppose. Uh,
Yeah,
Now, eventually, they did hear from our lawyers and wrote back to us, though, and we got the kind of change. There was some back
yeah.
and forth, though, because what often
There was a
happens,
lot of back and forth with both
yeah,
of them.
what happens in these conversations is people will often try to equivocate around, well, it wasn't a prayer, it was a blessing, or it was words of inspiration. And just because you repackage something doesn't make it less unconstitutional, right? You can call it whatever you want. We actually call this stealth prayer sometimes, where groups will say, oh, well, it was words of inspiration, or a message of hope, or whatever you want to call it. And it's seen as a way of smuggling prayer into meetings, and it's just not okay. Like you can't circumvent the law by saying, I'm not stealing, I'm, removing without permission. It doesn't change the fact that you're violating the Constitution.
Yeah, and the city of Parksville really kept coming back in its statements publicly to the fact they have a diverse practice because they have an indigenous blessing followed by the Christian blessing. And they did a weird conflation there where we have seen, and as we've, looked across all of these municipalities, we see that a lot of municipalities are including indigenous content, sometimes territorial acknowledgements, sometimes larger ceremonial, even blessings or indigenous prayers. And
Mm.
it's a complex issue we continue to study, and we'll have a lot more to say on in coming weeks. Maybe we can talk about it in a little bit. But we do think there's something different in there. And we've written about that in our decolonizing legislative prayer report and many of our others. And the city of Parksville just kind of went, they're the same thing. So why are you only picking on the Christian one?
And we've had I think like a good position. We've had a lot, and as Ian mentioned, lots of conversations about this. In all of our reports, we cover it. And because we're looking at the agendas and minutes of every municipal council meeting for inaugurals and selected ones for regular council meetings, we thought we'd also gather data on territorial acknowledgements. Now, this is performative, right? Like starting a meeting as we did today with a territorial acknowledgement is ultimately performative, and we prefer what a lot of my friends call reconciliation, so actually doing something. But at the same time, it is a nice pause for reflection, and so we've gathered that data as we've gone through and done our research, but we've always treated it as a separate category. And as Ian was mentioning, we saw a wide range of different practices. These will typically take place in inaugural council meetings where you get more, again, more ceremonial elements. And these can include any combination of singing, drumming, dancing, speeches, invocations, territorial acknowledgements, the exchange of gifts. We had a smudging example, I think two smudges in Alberta. And basically, the approach that we've recommended in this case is when it comes to Indigenous content, for municipalities to reach out to local Indigenous communities and invite them to do what they would do culturally appropriately to open a meeting. What we found is if you ask someone to do a blessing, they come do a blessing, surprise, and they frame it as a blessing. And if you ask someone to come do to drum, they'll come and drum. Whereas if you say, hey, what is appropriate for your community to do to welcome people to a formal meeting, they will do what's appropriate for their meeting. And so we see this as an important part of reconciliation. We've obviously explored in a lot more depth in our writing. And just as a quick pause, as it's a good time to talk about some of the numbers on this. We look at inaugural meetings in British Columbia in 2018, 38.8% had some Indigenous content. Again, that could have been an acknowledgement or drumming, speeches, etc. And in 2022, that number was up to 69.7%. And when we looked at regular council meetings, we've also noticed an increasing trend. So in 2018, you're again 38.8%. But when you go up to, say, for example, 2023, the number is 67.5%. And then in this past year, 71.3% in 2024. So it's an increasing trend. It's good to see. We will bring up some slides later on to show how that is not the case across the country. British Columbia is certainly an outlier, an early adopter of including territorial acknowledgements and Indigenous content in meetings. And as Ian mentioned, we do have some content coming out on that in the future. So maybe we'll not do too much of a spoiler alert. Well, we won't spoil that forthcoming report very soon, but we do have the data for this. And if people are interested, all the reports document that as well. But back to Parksville then, Ian. So as we've heard, there's some equivocation there, and we've treated these as different things. And I think one of the reasons, one of the very like clear legal reasons, is because Saguenay talked about prayer. And so when it comes to the conversation of Parksville, we can have a longer conversation about what does Indigenous content look like in a meeting? How do you have constructive reconciliation? But that's a conversation that's got nothing to do with Saguenay. Saguenay was incredibly clear. You cannot have prayer in a municipal council meeting. That is a duty of that state has a duty of religious neutrality, and that this is a democratic imperative. So the number of emails was voluminous. Do we include those in our appendix to the report? I can't
Not all
recall.
of them, no.
Not all of them,
Yeah.
but it was voluminous. We went back and forth, but eventually I think we got a concession. What was the final take
Yeah.
from Parkville?
In Parksville on April 30th, because things took a while, remember? Our lawyers started conversing in January. And in April, the city of Parksville said that they wished to confirm that at that time, They have no intention of including a prayer at its inaugural meeting after the next municipal election. The agenda for that inaugural will be set by the mayor-elect. At that time, the city will address your clients' expressed concerns with the mayor-elect for their consideration. We said that might have been fine in November or December. That's not enough for us now. So we kept pushing, and it took a little bit longer, and we kept pushing the city of Vancouver as well. And on May 31st, the city of Vancouver comes back from their lawyer and says, fine, okay, we will acknowledge that hosting prayers at the city of Vancouver's November 7th, 2022 inauguration ceremony was a breach of the duty of religious neutrality as set out by a movement like Québécois.
That was the whole email. Sorry, just to jump in here.
Yeah,
That was the entire email. Like it wasn't like a 6 pager where that was a pull quote. The email was literally like, hello, that one sentence, done. Which I think that was kind of one of the most clearest declarations of Saguenay is definitely applicable in Vancouver that we could possibly get.
yeah, and that was really rewarding to get. We'd gotten a promise to comply with constitutional obligations as set out in Saguenay a couple weeks earlier, and we just wanted to clarify what they thought happened in 2022. And for the city of Vancouver to admit it violated the charter with its 2022 multi-faith prayer sets, like, it's not a legal precedent in court that a court has said that's true, but the person who did it, the city who did it, has said that was wrong, and we can now use that, and we do, to emphasize to other municipalities, look, if the city of Vancouver, who probably has more money than your municipality to spend on lawyers, doesn't want to stand behind this, maybe you shouldn't either.
And actually, this is one of the ways that we've seen municipalities try to get around this. We're not going to talk, we will talk about our reports from other provinces, but here I wanted to underscore Winnipeg. The city of Winnipeg has a revolving prayer where different individuals, different councillors deliver prayers, and it can be religious or non-religious. And they apparently sought legal counsel after Saguenay came out. And their lawyer's conclusion was, well, if we don't just have a Christian prayer opening the meeting, it's okay. We FOI'd them on that and got a 2 page blank redacted document, which we thought was a little scant, given the fact that if you read Saguenay, it doesn't say no Christian prayer, it says no prayer. And it doesn't matter if you revolve it around. The issue, of course, is that you create a space where some views are favored over others. And just because you favor slightly different views the next week doesn't change that. And even the practice of opening a meeting with prayer of any religious tradition excludes non-believers, because then you're saying this is a space that privileges religion over non-religion. So it doesn't matter if you swap out the prayers, if you rotate them, if you roll a d20 and pick one at random before the meeting starts, it's still going to necessarily exclude people. And again, the best form of neutrality, as stated by Saguenay, is abstention. You just don't get involved. For those of you who are just joining us, this is the 10th anniversary of the Saguenay decision. This is the Supreme Court ruling in 2015 on this day, Neutrality Day, where the Canadian Supreme Court ruled that you can't have prayers in municipal council meetings. And we're just sort of talking about the history of our work in British Columbia. Ian, I think, with Vancouver, we've arrived at today's report. Can we drop our report?
I just want to close off
Oh, yeah,
Parksville
yeah,
because we
please.
got
Sorry, yeah,
one
yeah.
final response from
I'm getting
Parksville
excited
on
over here.
June 30th. It took 6 months of back and forth to finally get them to say, all right, if the mayor is reelected, he's not going to do a prayer. He's fine. He's not happy, but he's going to do that. And then if he's not reelected, the chief administrative officer will advise the mayor-elect and council of its obligations to ensure religious neutrality and to strongly recommend the mayor-elect not include religious prayers. Because I guess they haven't passed a bylaw to say this is how inaugural ceremonies work, but they will basically say if you do this, you get sued.
No one wants to start their new term in office with a lawsuit, and that's exactly what's going to happen. And actually, municipalities who are out there, if you're a municipal administrator, CAO, comptroller, do take note. Don't start off a new council in 2026 with a lawsuit. That's not the way to go. You want to make sure your council chambers are welcoming to all people and not excluding people.
Yeah. And the only other outlier from 2022 that we looked at
Mm.
was the district in Clearwater, where their agenda had said they were going to have an invocation, and they had had one in 2018 as well. And so we'd been writing to them, but we hadn't heard a good response. And we saw this invocation on their agenda, and so we put a press release to the Clearwater Times, and we put another email to the district CAO on October 31st, 2022, just like days before this ceremony was set to happen. Um, And we got a reply saying, "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," from the CAO. And the minutes still say invocation, but it doesn't say who did it, versus every other part of the agenda and minutes say like, "Oh, this elder delivered this territorial acknowledgement." And then we watched the video and it went, and we just couldn't hear anything.
And
So
this
we
has happened
don't
a few,
know. And
and this
it's
has
not
happened,
even
yeah.
looking at who's speaking.
And this has happened a few times, like in other municipalities across the country, they will use like a form to fill in for their minutes, and they just have a legacy line for invocation or prayer or whatever. So this is kind of why we always try to cross-reference with audiovisual content. By the way, this is our amazing research team. So we have a team of volunteer researchers who help us with this data. There are volunteer researchers right now working on gathering data for New Brunswick, and we're almost done with that province. And so if you're out there and you're listening and you're interested in getting involved, our research team has opportunities for everyone of all walks of life, all levels of experience. Sometimes we just want you to go to a mid-tier municipal council meeting, try and find the minutes to a meeting. Sometimes we're asking folks to help us transcribe prayers so we can analyze their content. And sometimes if you're interested in helping actually write reports, we have roles for folks in that as well. And our research is wide-ranging. We don't just do legislative prayer. We're looking at everything from school district policy to tax policy to medical assistance in unaliving to a whole bunch of other elements. So if you're ever interested and you're out there and you're interested in how you can help with research advocacy that the BC Humanists do, and you don't have the funds to donate, and or you have the funds to donate, please get involved as a volunteer as well.
How many volunteers are we up to, Teale?
Oh gosh, I don't actually even know because there's like the spreadsheet is really long. It was over 60 last time I checked. And by the way, like you're on our volunteer list, you can drop in. We have someone who's currently editing one of our research papers on her phone when she's on the train to work in Toronto. And sometimes we have amazing volunteers who will write, full reports. And we also have like a relatively rigorous academic approach. And a lot of our papers, if they hit the right academic standard, we'll submit them to journals. So if you're a young academic out there and you're thinking, I need a few more publications, or I'd like to put something in the Canadian Parliamentary Review, get in touch. We have a couple really cool projects on the horizon that I think will be really interesting for folks.
Yeah, I see one of our volunteers, I think, is in the chat and pointing out that, yeah, you don't have to physically go to meetings. It's all like from your desk at home or on the phone, just looking at virtual content. I
It's
mean, if
super
you're
hands
really,
off too. We're not doing like regular like weekly meetings unless we have to for our projects. It's you can plug away at some of our projects when you can. And there's a lot of data to gather. You'll notice from like the projects we're talking about for British Columbia, we looked at every one of the 162, now 160 municipalities. But across the country, any municipality with a population of over 1,000, we went to their website, we found the minutes and their agendas for inaugural and two randomly selected regular council meetings. And that's a fun adventure. You get to see some pretty wild websites. I don't want to put Spall Machine on blast here, but the lovely district of Spall Machine had 3 fonts on their homepage. 3 fonts, Ian. So yeah, you get into some really interesting adventures. And then also some of the meetings, like we were talking about ceremonial elements. Like sometimes there was at least 2 meetings that I recall seeing where the mayor did a shot of whiskey with the piper. There's a town crier in a couple of districts that show up with a tricorn hat and oye their way through an announcement. So you get to see a really interesting sort of inside look at small municipalities that not a lot of people are going to be paying attention to. So it's quite a fun project.
so let's talk about Prayer Free BC. We've been talking about a big chunk of what this new report is. This is on our website today. I'll put the link in the chat as well, where you can go find the landing page and read about this. As mentioned, we wrote in 2019 the duty of neutrality about prayer in BC municipalities. After that, we've written so many reports. We published, I'm just going
We're
to
at
pull up
7
the
now, I
list.
think, right, Ian?
Saguenay was in 2020, our
Yeah,
duty of neutrality.
that's right.
We did a Manitoba report in 2022 and an Ontario report in 2022. In 2023, we had our update to BC. We yelled it until we stopped. And last year, we put out reports on Alberta and Saskatchewan. Um,
We're working our way
there's
across the country here, friends. I will say we're doing one report for each province, except for Ontario. We found some pretty eye-opening results. Well, we're not going to jump to Ontario just yet because we're talking about prayer-free BC. I think Ian undersold it. So because in 2018 we identified 26 municipalities that violated the Constitution by including prayer in their inaugural council meetings. Years of advocacy that we've been talking about here whittled that number down to 7. in the 2022 inaugural meetings. And since that time, we had a chance to look at not just the inaugural meetings, but also regular council meetings. So that means our volunteers went to 3 randomly selected dates for regular council meetings to verify if those meetings included prayer or not. And we did not find any across the province. And so we can officially declare British Columbia unconstitutional prayer free in municipalities. It is absolutely a fantastic testament to the hard work of the BC Humanist Association.
Yeah, we were pretty confident we were there once we got that commitment from Vancouver and Parksville, but with the additional confirmation of every regular council meeting, we have no problem saying this. And it's notable that, we're a decade after the Supreme Court ruling, and we're still finding places in other provinces that are including prayer, or even sometimes try to sneak it in here in British Columbia. And one of the things I've been asked by journalists a few times is like, why do they still do this if it's unconstitutional? I'm like, well, there are no police for the Constitution. There's no one out there investigating compliance with Supreme Court rulings. That's how your rights can be violated on this, but on so many other issues. And I think what we're highlighting here is just the importance of doing the work either as an activist organization like the BC Humanist Association or individuals, and know your rights and challenge unconstitutional infringements of them when the state overreaches.
And Ian, you included a new section in this report. So in the report, the Prayer Free BC, we document all the analysis looking at regular council meetings, the conversation we've just had about the progress we had with the 7 outlying municipalities, we document that. We looked at regular council meetings. We summarize the growing trend of Indigenous content that we've already described. And then Ian included a new section which kind of explores other areas. Because as you were mentioning, Ian, like it's not just about prayer. Like, this is very symbolic and performative ultimately, but it translates the bias in favor of religion over non-religion or some religions over other religions translates into policy as well. So this is stuff that you're going to see on the horizon as we move forward. Looking at this issue in British Columbia, it's not just prayer, it's things like nativity scenes over the winter holidays. It's proclamations. One of the things that's really interesting is we have our proclamation from Vancouver and our proclamation from Toronto, but some municipalities don't have policy on proclamations. And as a result, they could get tricked into accidentally acknowledging a country that doesn't exist, or they could declare December Christian Heritage Month and other things like that. And we want to make sure that our governments are being neutral when it comes to religion, because when you have a state that's necessarily putting its finger on the scale, it's making some people feel less welcome. So look for some exciting work on that. I think we're going to be putting together, I guess you and I are the ones who decide what we put together, but a guide to encouraging municipalities on how they can be secular. Because a lot of times municipalities, they just do what they did last time. We're going to, oh, this year it's a such and such celebration. We're going to do it again. But times are changing. Our communities are becoming more diverse, and we have Supreme Court rulings like Saguenay. And so ultimately, we need to help guide them through that process and how they can make their procedures and their practices, the events they acknowledge, even things like flying flags out in front of municipal halls. Those need to be guided by a lens of state neutrality. Now, Ian,
Yeah,
what I was going to say was, when we look across the province, you were mentioning we look across the country, we see examples of municipalities still violating the Constitution. Again, this is 10 years to today that the Saguenay decision was rendered, and yet we're still seeing municipalities violating the Constitution. Maybe I can take us on a quick journey through some of the numbers that we have from across the country. Do you have a graph that we can put up for the map?
yeah. First, I'll put up our Saguenay project landing page
Yeah.
here. We'll
So this is
zoom
a this is a project that's kind of coalesced from all of our reports. For people who are interested in finding all of our publications, head over here. It's bchumanist.ca/Saguenay, and we have links to all of our reports. And those reports are working our way across the country. So we now have, as Ian mentioned, 3 for British Columbia. The next report we looked at was Manitoba. And when we looked at, here they are, look at this, brilliant. When we looked at Manitoba, we found 6 municipalities in their 2018 inaugural council meetings included prayer. That's about 5.9%. And regular council meetings, it was 4 out of 101, so 4%. And that was, kind of a trend that we saw in most provinces. When we looked at Alberta, surprisingly, their 2021 inaugurals, only 6 municipalities, or 3.5%, had prayer, and 6 municipalities had, out of 177, so 3.4%, had prayer in their regular council meetings. Surprisingly, not all the same municipalities. Similarly, in Saskatchewan, 3 out of 90 had prayers in their 2020 inaugural council meetings, and 2 out of 95 had prayers in their regular council meetings. That's about 2%. The reason why these numbers don't all quite add up, insofar as there's slightly different denominators, is we often weren't able to find information for either regular council meetings or inaugural council meetings. Large municipalities have robust systems in place to allow people to find minutes and agendas, but some very small municipalities, their websites are less reliable. We always correspond with municipalities to try and find information, and I'm sure there's a couple of very confused municipal administrators out there that are wondering why why they're getting an email from a random person on Vancouver Island. But it is really, part of our important research. But the big outlier, and it's not the pièce de résistance, isn't the right term, but the province with the most problematic content, the most unconstitutional prayers in their inaugural meetings was Ontario. So in their 2022 inaugural meetings, we found, their 2018 inaugural meetings, we found 156 municipalities out of 328, so 47.6% included prayer in their inaugural meetings. That's almost half of the municipalities with a population of over 1,000 violating the Constitution in 2018. Now, 9 out of 360 municipalities had prayer on a regular basis, which is kind of consistent with other provinces. But the fact that almost 50% of municipalities in Ontario opened their inaugural meetings in 2018 with prayer was alarming. We have a report coming out that's looking at the 2022 inaugural meetings for Ontario. We have an amazing team of volunteers that are currently transcribing those prayers. What I can tell you, we're not going to spoil the report, but we've been doing some advocacy, been working with a lawyer friend in Ontario, and we've halved that number. So it's no longer 156. In 2022, it was lower than half, so somewhere in the 70s. So look for that report coming out soon. But that's still a significant percentage of municipalities that are violating the Constitution in Ontario. And we can already see the impact of our work between 2018 and 2022 with the number halving, but there's still more work to be done.
Close this share to make it a little bit easier to see you again.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So the
I'm really proud of
comparison,
the
oh, go
graphs we
ahead, sorry.
put in there and the data. And I think one of the things that's made our work so effective is just that commitment to having the data and building the arguments so that when we bring our advocacy to municipal councils or government at different levels, we're not just, you know, the random people yelling at them who can be easily ignored. We have strong arguments, and particularly as we've built that credibility, we've attracted top legal talent who can also back up our threats with substance if it needs to go even further. And it's, been rewarding to make this advantage.
And it's interesting too, there's some pretty interesting trends that we tend to see. So our lawyer friend in Ontario will reach out to a municipality and say, hey, will you commit to not having prayer in your meetings? And their typical response is, we don't have prayers in our meetings. And then we're like, well, here's a transcript and a link to your website where you have actively invited a member of the clergy to deliver a prayer in your meeting. And then they almost inevitably will say, oh, well, that's just our inaugural meetings. And then the haggling and back and forth takes place. Some municipalities will quickly change their policies. Some of them will haggle a bit more and will go back and forth, as we were kind of talking about with Parksville. And yeah, it's kind of an interesting legal dance. But in this case, like, we have a very clear Supreme Court ruling. It's not wishy-washy in any way. It's definitive that the state can't include prayer in a municipal council meeting. And so, yeah, I think anytime a municipal lawyer looks at our correspondence and then looks at the Supreme Court ruling, they come to the same conclusion, which is we shouldn't be doing this anymore, and they discontinue the practice. We also have
So
some. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm conscious of the time. So let's wrap this up and then maybe look ahead and like the broader context, because one of the feedback I always get is, or not always, but a few people do point out, like, does municipal prayers matter? And we could talk about that in the broader context. But let's wrap up on Prayer Free BC.
And you're watching the chat, so if there's any questions, this is a great time to ask them, friends. You've got, I can say this humbly, that we have written, you did the math, Ian, over 800 pages of reports and peer-reviewed book chapters and publications on unconstitutional prayer in Canadian politics. So you happen to have two of the most, I wouldn't say experts, maybe prolific writers with some very niche expertise in this area. So if you're in the comments and you want to ask us any questions around that, now is the time. We won't do the teacher pause because it makes for bad radio. But if you have those questions, pop them in the comments.
We've
But yeah,
also written a lot on satirical examinations of religion and astrology from our April 1st reports,
that's right.
which
Oh,
have
I've
been a lot of fun.
gone fuzzy here. Hold on. There we go. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's I think we may also be professional astrologers at some point. That's a whole other conversation. Folks who are interested should take a deep dive into some of our April Fool's Day reports where we, and for example, analyze the astrological symbols of the BC legislature because there's, quote, too much Libra energy in Victoria. Um, so yeah, Ian, you were talking about like what's the broader context. So yes, opening a meeting with prayer is a performative element. It doesn't cost anything necessarily. Like you're not spending money to bring a pastor from across the country into a meeting to open it with prayer. But there's a couple of impacts here. The first one I've already kind of mentioned, which is it necessarily creates an environment where some people are made to feel less welcome. And that's critical. When it comes to municipal politics, we want people to feel welcome. And so I can't underscore that enough. And now that I've seen it from both sides of the desk, I can definitely say that we want to encourage people to be sharing their views with municipal councils. There's been an erosion of trust these days in our political system, and one of the ways that we can build trust is by talking to people face to face, hearing what they have to say, and we don't want to only be hearing from some people and not others. We want to be welcoming everybody. But there's more to it than that, right? So when you have, for example, a preferential treatment for religion and specific religions in the performative element, that may also translate to things like your tax dollars. Like it's tax season. We just wrapped up our budgets here in Saanich, and a significant percentage of our budget is going to support religious institutions in our district through tax exemptions. We're giving away over $1 million to places of worship to support their work, and that is that's something we should be investigating, right? And we are actually here at the BC Humanist Association.
Well, and for me, the fight around prayers and municipal councils is a way to strengthen the duty of religious neutrality. So we had a very clear Supreme Court ruling. Um, the US for a long time had very clear Supreme Court rulings around the Establishment Clause and what that meant, but it got chipped away at over time by Christian nationalists, by far right groups, and these ones who wanted to take it down. And they stacked the courts, and it's gone now, frankly. Like, there are a few good Supreme Court justices up there who still know what America was founded on, but for the most part, they are willing to say that it's fine to give money to religious groups, it's fine to discriminate, and it's bleak, frankly. And so, what I have been trying to do with our work here is to take those incremental wins, even if they're small, even if it's we got the village of Belcara to pass an emergency resolution, we can use that and we can continue to build that momentum to defend secularism at every level. And that means protecting abortion rights. That means protecting end of life rights and every LGBTQ2S plus rights. And so that's where we're going with that.
Yeah, and it's these little symbolic measures. I think often people think of these big dramatic changes, but it's a small erosion over time, and that's kind of why I was really excited to include the new section in the new report on some of the other aspects that we've seen in municipalities, whether it's hosting a nativity scene on the roof of the municipality, but also, for example, whether it's giving grants to groups that fund crisis pregnancy centers that actively lie to people experiencing unplanned pregnancy and in a vulnerable situation to try to dissuade them from having an abortion. These are all connected in that way. Things like proclamations as well and flying the flag out in front of a municipality. Um, you can see this where you have, people, bigots and haters trying to come in and declare the pride flag to be, a symbol of hate and have it taken down during Pride Month and yet try to fly the Christian flag in front of municipalities. All these kinds of examples which, as you mentioned, are cumulative. And so it's not these giant, massive victories. But the other thing, too, I wanted to underscore this, too, Ian, is when we do get those massive victories, because today is the 10th anniversary of Saguenay, the critical step, the work isn't done because Saguenay was adopted 10 years ago today, and yet we still have dozens of municipalities across Canada that are opening their meetings with prayer. So the work of the BC Humanists is critical in that way, and that we have to have someone mop up and monitor, to be those prayer police, if you will, to monitor the impact of these Supreme Court rulings that were so hard fought. Like, as you mentioned, Alain Simoneau complained to his municipality in 2006. The Supreme Court ruled on Saguenay in 2015, and here we are 10 years later, almost 20 years after Alain put his initial complaint in, still talking about the fact that there are municipalities in Canada that open their meetings with unconstitutional prayer. But not only that, I feel like but wait, there's more. Canadian Parliament opens its daily sessions with prayer. In BC, they open their daily sessions with prayer. In municipalities, legislatures across the country, we see meetings opening with prayer. There's been some change, and we're also working on that level as well. But you can see this at every level of government. For people who are interested, we will be continuing our House of Prayers project, where we're looking at prayer in the BC legislature. Every few years, we analyze those prayers for religious content, we transcribe them, and we are working to make change across the country as well to abolish that practice in the legislatures, because it filters down. It filters down to things like tax policy and tax exemptions for charitable groups that are spreading, lies and misinformation around pregnancy, for example.
Yeah, we're seeing some positive progress in Manitoba, where the new government there under Wakanu is eager to revise the practice, although it does sound like they're going to probably be closer to a British Columbia model than Nova Scotia, who only a couple years ago got rid of its opening prayer. I do see in the comments, Desnick wants to know about Remembrance Day ceremonies and how to enforce religion-free services. And that's a fantastic question, and one we've worked on a little bit. We haven't done it as systematically as any of this stuff on municipal prayers or even provincial prayers. And it's a bit challenging, right? Because the Legion is usually the group that runs a Remembrance Day ceremony, and they are a private organization that can technically do their ceremonies however they want within the Human Rights Code. Um,
And they're held on, but they are also held on municipal land. In my municipality, when I was elected, right after I was elected, we were elected in October. November's right around the corner. I talked to our staff about this, and it's challenging because the Legion is running it, but they're hosting it in our case right on municipal property. And so their solution was to invite a couple other religious figures and to bring in someone to deliver a secular poem. The previous Remembrance Day service had been run service, and I use that term to describe accurately what it was run by a pastor and was very Christian focused. The subsequent iterations were still run by the same Christian pastor, but included a wider religious representation. We had a Buddhist monk a couple of years ago. Last year, there was a member of the Muslim Association. But there's also other ways. I think this is just something to underscore, Ian. There's other ways to solemnify a meeting without doing prayer. Because, we recognize that there's a need as humans to take a moment and say, hey, this is an important meeting. We're entering an important moment. Let's get our heads in the game. Let's all, be serious, or let's all approach this issue with the right level of respect and dignity. And the problem, of course, with opening a meeting with prayer is that you're necessarily starting the meeting off with, a constitutional violation. But we've seen some places give minutes of silence. So take a minute of silence to reflect on however you want to start the meeting. We've also seen secular poems and moments where people have read inspirational words. And those are other ways that we can recognize the beginning of a meeting. You don't have to, of course. You can just get started. But back to the point of Remembrance Day, there's a wide range of ways of solemnifying that very important day that includes everybody. I remember talking to my residents about this. There were people who were upset that we had dialed back the number of Christian prayers at the Remembrance Day service. And I was like, well, I have Jewish ancestors who fought and died killing Nazis overseas, and atheist ancestors as well. So we want to make sure that those folks are included. That's gonna be part of our secular municipal guide that we're going to be putting together. So that's a great question, and I think if folks have feedback on that, to share with us, because we are in the process of developing that guide to help navigate that very complicated space.
Yeah, the Canadian military appointed its first humanist chaplain just a couple of years ago, Mary Claire Kadich. And she and some non-religious humanist members of the armed forces have been working for a few years, and it actually came out, I think it was last year, a new guidance for prayers in the military, and that immediately generated a big backlash because the military is kind of a small c conservative institution just by its own nature. And the people who are really supportive of it, many of them are non-religious, although I also know a bunch of hard leftists in the military too. It's a very interesting space. And there's a desire, I think, within the armed forces to recognize the challenges they've had with diversity and inclusion, and to move forward to be a stronger force that represents Canada. And they're working towards it. And I think that guidance that started, and it did get a little bit of a pause, um, will help local legions run their remembrance ceremonies better in the future, and we'll continue to encourage it. And we definitely try when we can to work with veterans to speak up about this, because I think their voice is the strongest when talking about, I want my Remembrance Day ceremony to include me. So humanist veterans are.
And we already have, like, there already is an Indigenous Veterans Day as well. But it's not as, it's getting more recognized, but it's another conversation to have as well. That's a couple days before Remembrance Day. And yeah, I think the other thing I think I would underscore the most of this is these public ceremonies are ones that serve our communities, and they aren't set in stone. they just because something's a tradition doesn't mean we can't inspect it and update it and change it and bring it in line with the purposes and the changes in our community. We want these ceremonies to represent people in the community and make them feel welcome and serve the purpose they were originally intended to serve. And so that means looking at these traditions and updating them as the times change and as we want to become more inclusive, and also recognizing the state's duty of religious neutrality. Great question, though. That one's one of the more sticky wickets, and I think it's going to be the hardest to write section of our municipal guide for
Yeah.
sure.
So there's so much on all the time. I'm conscious of the time, so I think we'll end it there and let people go back to work if that's what you do, or maybe just wanted to watch this on the side of your desk. Thank you so much. It was great to see concurrent viewers. We had about 14 at a time, but we'll get more over the time, and that's about how much we'd have if we had a Zoom meeting. And this was fairly fun. I feel bad it wasn't as engaging as some of the Zoom chats we've had in the past, but hopefully we can do this more often. And I don't know, neither of us have ever really been streamers, but maybe that's in the future for the Humanist
Hey, we
Association.
only said like and subscribe twice in the meeting here, and so it's worth saying one more time, friends. Hit the like and subscribe button. And finally, I will say this: we are an organization that is funded by donations from people like you and folks who are tuning into this much later on. So please do support our work. Our work is having a huge impact. As you've seen, we've been able to declare British Columbia prayer-free, which is a huge accomplishment given that at least 26 municipalities were violating the Constitution in 2018 by including prayer in their inaugural meetings. And we're going to keep going. We've got reports coming out for the Maritimes, for Newfoundland and Labrador, and of course reports covering a wide range of other subjects that our research team covers. So we really are grateful for the support that people give us, and please give us as much as possible.
Happy Religious Neutrality Day. And I clicked end stream now. Hopefully
Hey, yeah, there we go.
hopefully that delay